Jesus Christ, according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Now my microphone's on. Okay, it's the gathered wisdom of the community that is passed on from one generation to the next. It's what we call tradition, what we call a code of conduct, what we in the Old Testament called Torah. The other one is more of an internal sense of authority. It's hinted at in the scripture, and it's what we might call the wisdom of the heart. Now, we have to realize, as Jesus said, that what comes from the heart is not just wisdom, but the heart is also that source of impulse, of selfishness and malice. But there's also that ability within us to be wise and to make decisions and to know right from wrong. And you get the idea that that wisdom of the heart is schooled by the tradition. So Torah. Literally in the Old Testament, it's the first 5 books of the Bible. It contains the narratives from Genesis. It contains the story of the Exodus. It contains all the ordinances and statutes that were given to the people as they traveled through the wilderness. And it is also Deuteronomy, this last book of Torah, which is Moses standing before the children of Israel, standing before the Hebrew people, and teaching them, preaching to them, preparing them for their standing right on the edge of wilderness and promised land. They're about to pass over into the promised land, and Moses knows that he cannot go there with them. They have been freed from bondage in Egypt. They've spent a generation wandering in the wilderness, and now they are about to cross into the promised land. And Moses says to them, remember your history, remember that wisdom that's been passed down to you, and if you can remember that, then you can thrive in freedom in the promised land. You can have all the good things of this life, and you can be the envy of all the peoples of the world, for they will see your wisdom, they will see your discernment. Now, Torah in the New Testament is often translated as law from the Greek nomos. But it's not the best translation of this word Torah. For Torah the root of the word Torah comes from an indication of the direction to go, a pointing in the way that we should go, the ways that we should live. So it's more like instruction, the instruction of a loving parent for the children. And throughout the Jewish history, throughout the history of the people of Israel, Torah was an identity marker, a way for them to know who they are. As they built a nation, as they lived under corrupt kings, as they were living in exile in Babylon, and as they lived under occupation of the Roman Empire, to follow Torah was to know who we are. We are the people who live in this particular way. So knowing that, I have great sympathy for the Pharisees as they engage Jesus in our gospel lesson this morning. Imagine these religious leaders living under occupation and desperately trying to keep the people together. Desperately saying to people, remember who you are. Follow the traditions. Follow Torah. If you don't, we'll lose it. And then there's this guy, Jesus, who's constantly breaking with tradition. He's healing on the Sabbath. He's eating with unclean people, with sinners. And in this story that we hear today, he's allowing his disciples not to follow the cultic rituals that were necessary before eating. Now, it's all about hand washing before eating, right? But this has nothing to do with hygiene. This has to do with a cultic ritual of cleansing. And Jesus is allowing the disciples to make decisions, to discern with the wisdom of the heart when they needed to do it and when they didn't need to do it. And so you see the Pharisees in that exchange with Jesus, questioning whether the wisdom of the heart is what we should follow. Shouldn't we follow the tradition? This week, I've been so inspired by all of the remembrances of Senator John McCain. all of the stories, all of the reflections on his life. And one that stuck out to me was the point that John McCain had an internal voice, a moral compass that allowed him never to deceive himself and to know the truth of his actions, when they were right and when they were wrong. He had that internal moral voice that when it was important to him, he could be very stubborn in his belief, like he was with torture. There was no time when that was appropriate. But he was also a pragmatic leader who could recognize that sometimes he needed to pivot. And when he pivoted and realized that he made a mistake, he was able to recognize that, change course. So whenever his internal moral voice is talked about, I also would hear talk about this code of honor with which he was raised. This tradition that had been passed down to him from his grandfather and his father because of their service in the Navy. And as I listened to the retelling of his life, I realized that that code of honor became that inner moral compass when he was in prison in Vietnam. It was there that he realized that sometimes the code of honor had to be compromised in order to survive. There were times when it was necessary to live to uphold it, but there were also times when perhaps a compromise was necessary so that he could survive, so that his fellow captives could survive. And I thought, that's the wisdom of the heart. There's a humorous story that illustrates this. And it wasn't about the code of honor of his naval pedigree, but was about his mother's moral code. And I heard this in a rebroadcast of an interview with Terry Gross, where she interviewed John McCain several years ago. And he tells the story that when he was in prison in Vietnam, that when his captors would come to take him from his cell to the room where he would be interrogated and tortured, he would yell obscenities at his captors. He would call them all kinds of foul names. And he did this, he said, so that he could boost the morale of the other men who were in the prison, so that they would know that he was resisting. So he wrote about that in his book, The Faith of Our Fathers. And right before it was published, there was an excerpt in a magazine, and he sent that magazine to his mother, who's, 106 now, was 90 or something at the time. And so his mother called him after she read it, and he said, well, Mom, what did you think? And she said, I think I'm going to come over to your house and wash your mouth out with soap. He said, Mom, these were bad men. They were doing horrible things to me. She said, in no circumstance did I raise you to use that language. And so Terry Gross asked him, well, what did you learn from that? What lesson did you take away from that? And he sort of chuckled, and he spoke very respectfully and lovingly of his mother and all that she had taught him. But he also recognized that perhaps there was a time and a place for foul language. It's that schooling of the heart that allows for the wisdom to know when we keep tradition and when we break tradition. You know, we live in a time when tradition and codes of honor, even the rule of law, is somewhat suspect. And sometimes I wonder, how are we going to know who we are? How are we we going to know who we are? I want to be clear, I like change. I'm aware every Sunday morning that for much of my childhood, women were not allowed to be preaching from pulpits or celebrating at altars. And I am grateful every single day for the men and the women who broke laws so that I could fully live out God's call on my life. But I still wonder, how are we going to know who we are? So this day, as in every day, the invitation is to realize that we are standing right there on the boundary between wilderness and promised land. And we're invited to embrace, to uphold our tradition, to learn from all that has come before us. And we're also called to cultivate that wisdom of the heart so that we can fully live into who God has created us to be. Thanks be to God.